Welcome to Aotearoa Tomorrow. Today I'm joined by Natalia Cleland of the DCM. Now, Natalia, could you tell me a bit about what the DCM is? I know you're based in Wellington, and the origins of the organisation.
Sure thing. So kia ora, and thanks for having me on, Arthur. DCM, Downtown Community Ministry, is a small organisation based in Wellington, like you said, working with the most marginalised, with the people who are rough sleeping and doing it pretty hard on the streets and couch surfing. So we've been around for 54 years, and the organisation sort of started from a number of inner city churches who were all doing the same kind of work with marginalised people and vulnerable people, and they got together and thought, well, let's do this united. And so years ago, that's what DCM began through. So it was called Inner City Ministry at that time, and it's sort of changed over the years about what its focus has been. So it's always been people who have been on the fringes. At times it has been heavily focused on benefit rights and advocacy around that space, around women. And probably in the last 20 or so years, the focus has been on homelessness and ending homelessness. Our tagline is "Together we can end homelessness," and our vision is for people to be in communities where they're valued, thriving, housed, connected. So yeah, it's grown and it's changed, but it's still a fairly grassroots, small organisation in the scheme of things, and really trying to meet the needs of people who are excluded from other services and probably have very tricky, high and complex needs that make them quite difficult to engage with.
So the DCM is contracts to the government to provide services to the New Zealand public as well, right?
We have some contracts, and that's sort of changed over time as well. So we used to be primarily focused, funded through donations of putia, of money and of time. That has changed in the last couple of years. We've stepped into a housing first contract, and that's with HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and that really grew our organisation. We went from about sort of 15 staff to 50 in a couple of years, and are now around 60. So that contract with Housing and Urban Development with HUD for the Housing First service is one of our bigger contracts. However, we still rely on donations to fund a really significant, and I mean significantly important, part of the work that we do, which we do as a health service and sort of our duty frontline service. So yeah, we do have some government contracts. We also have an outreach service which is funded through Wellington City Council, and it's a really unique and amazing service that isn't really replicated very many, if any, other places around the country. And so we get some funding and support through Wellington City Council as well to do that part of our service.
Okay, so this is interesting because you're funded to do housing first by the government. You're funded through the council for your outreach service, and then also that's also funded through donations as well.
That's right. Yes, and it's a bit of a continuum. So what we know works for people who are really, others would say that they're difficult to engage with, is by meeting people where they are. And so whilst Housing First is an amazingly successful program, you still need to build relationships and trust and rapport with people who it can take a long time to build that relationship with. One of the things about the Housing First contract is that people need to give their consent to be part of that. And consent means that they are agreeing to have a key worker, they're agreeing to home visits, they're agreeing to a degree of support. And what we know is that it actually takes a lot of work for some people, and time and energy and repetition of engagement for people who have been burnt by the services or don't trust the services to say yes. to a service like that. And so that's where the outreach service is really, really important, that we're going and finding people where they are, and building trust and rapport and relationship with people. And that can take a long time, but it's so valuable. It's really significantly important.
So how did you get involved with all of this?
I'm a social worker is my background, and I'd worked at Oranga Tamariki. It was Child, Youth and Family at the time, and that sort of says how long ago that was. And I worked there for about 9 years. I was a frontline social worker, and then I moved into the Chief Social Worker's Office and National Office, and was there for 5 years and learnt a lot. It's amazing working in a government department. You get to see how the wheels spin, and how information is shared, how data is collected, what's done with that data and information. And I really enjoyed that. But I felt like I'd trained as a social worker and had really only just dipped my toe in. And so I dropped down to 4 days a week and started volunteering somewhere as a social worker. Loved it, saw a job at DCM and applied for it. And I've been here this is my 7th year. It's a really great space to be in an NGO where you can, every day you engage with people and you can make a difference and you can really support people and you can spend time with people and hear their stories and hear what's gone on for them. You get a really good sense of what's happened in people's lives to end up where they are. And you can advocate for people as well. There's a degree of bureaucracy, and of course we protect our relationships with our government department colleagues, not just the ones that fund us, but that's hugely important that we're able to have great relationships and that we're a high trust organisation with the partners that we work with, so that we can support the people who are saying, can you help me?
The reason I wanted to speak to someone from DCM or who was focused on frontline work with people who are unhoused is that for people who have, I remember living in Wellington in 2005, and the number of people who lived in Wellington then who were homeless, it seemed, it was not visible apart from Blanket Man and a few other very prominent characters. And over the years, we've seen the visibility of homelessness grow. And this is happening at the same time as the housing crisis. And it feels like you could almost leave it at that. Of course, we have a housing crisis and we have an increase in homelessness. Or a visible increase in homelessness. But the housing crisis itself tends to be, phenomenally expensive houses are becoming even more expensive. So it's hard to see how that shift would be pushing people into homelessness. And the other thing is, it feels very hard to understand the scale of the problem in New Zealand, because how do you reach the homeless? You can't turn up at their house with a census, right? By definition. And, or people living in holiday parks, for example, or sleeping in their cars. And it makes me wonder, A, what the scale is, and B, what are the driving forces? And I have tried to find statistics and found some, but they've been if you look at the method of collection, I've had to be like, it's not even a statistic you could use as a starting point, because the methodology is so frail that you wouldn't actually take it seriously in the first place.
Yeah. I look at some of those same stats. I think, what do we have? Sort of 25,000 households on the wait list for social housing. That's one point of data that you can look at and measure fairly consistently over time. I think that how MSD collect that information really hasn't changed. So that's sort of one data set that I suppose you can say at least it's consistent. I guess what it doesn't tell you is the number of people who are homeless that aren't on the social housing wait list. So that's a few people that we're working with who we're still working with them around motivation. And I think that's, my point sort of earlier on about how long it can take to even build trust and rapport with somebody. We're talking about, it could be years for somebody to even say, yes, please put my name on the social housing register. Yes, please, let the government department know that I am homeless and I'd like a house. So you're right. There's not a great way of collecting that stats. For the last 2 census, DCM has facilitated Stats New Zealand coming here and doing the census with people. And that was a way of allowing people to have their voice and yes, to say, hey, I'm homeless, or I live in a backpackers and I'm homeless, or I have a house, and also to share as much as they want to around their disabilities and the quality of their home if they did have one, and so on and so on. But again, that's a group of people who come here and have trusted us or the Stats New Zealand people enough to share their information. So yeah, I think we have seen an increase of people rough sleeping. I think, however, sometimes the media has a part to play in that, in terms of maybe when there's something kind of big going on, like if there's 1 or 2 people who are rough sleeping in Wellington and a few people are complaining about that, then the media really is in on that and kind of perpetuates probably this feeling of unsafety, or it's increasing, or whatever the story is. But there's also seasonal changes as well. So you tend to see more people rough sleeping over the warmer months and less over winter. But again, we're talking about visible versus not visible, aren't we?
Yeah. So when you say rough sleeping, can we define, I'm sure everyone has a general idea, but could you define what you mean by the term?
Yes, thank you. And when I'm talking about homeless, I'm talking about in emergency housing. I'm talking about in transitional housing. I'm talking about living in those backpackers and lodges. That's homeless. I'm talking about couch surfing. I'm talking about living in a caravan park or a holiday park. I'm talking about living in a van. When we talk about rough sleeping, we're talking about on the street. We also would say rough sleeping, would use that in conjunction with talking about a car. So rough sleeping might not always be on the street, but we might be also talking about people in a vehicle, or in shacks, like uninhabitable shacks. So yeah, that real sharp end, as opposed to maybe being under a roof but still homeless, like emergency housing or transitional housing or a boarding house, which is still homeless but not rough sleeping.
And there's another tricky thing here, and that is that, certainly I've lived in a van for a while. I have many friends who've lived in vans or boats. I had a friend who lived in a hammock in the town belt for a few years, but this was all by choice. It was because obviously rent's expensive, and that sometimes requires having a job and you don't want to, but you want to live off savings and you can extend them that way.
Yeah. There's something I think it's interesting around choice. I would say, and maybe this I've misunderstood, but I would say if someone is living in their van because rent's too high, I would say that that's not really a choice. Yes, okay, maybe they're choosing to live in the van because they'd rather have all of their income rather than 10% of it, because the rest is going to their rent. But is that really a choice? I don't know. I'm not sure that is. I think though, when I'm talking, it's tricky for me because I work in this particular organization. I know that we're seeing the most marginalized, and I know that the people that come to mind for me are not necessarily representative of the 25,000, say, on the wait list. So I always try and almost caveat the things I say by acknowledging that I'm thinking about the most complex people. What we know from our own data, and as I say, we're a small organisation, we support around 1,200 people a year. Our outreach team every quarter, for instance, supports around 180 people who are homeless. And And I know from our recent stats that that the people that our team are supporting, that the majority of them have around 3 complexity factors, like a mental health issue, a substance abuse disorder, a head injury, an issue around literacy, some other form of disability, so criminal history, etc., etc. So the people that we're working with tend to have at least 3 factors that make their life more difficult than yours and my life. So whilst someone like you may live in a van because you'd rather have your income for yourself, someone else might live in the van because they would also like that. But also there's 3 or 4 things that have stopped them from getting a rental somewhere anyway. So yeah, it's
Right. Like, I suppose, if you want to get a rental, you've got to be able to fill out the form, for example. And that itself can be kind of a hard thing. I mean, I remember when I was, 17 or 18, forms were just intimidating because I hadn't filled out very many of them. But then you've also got additional things like having to have a bank account, which is more forms. It means having an ID, which you've got to get from either a driver's license or a passport or what have you. There's a lot of administrative work that has to be completed in someone's life prior to them even getting to the point of being eligible to have a tenancy. And when I think about who did that all for me, it was my parents. And I feel like that's another major part of the difference between someone who lives in a van because they want to save on rent versus someone who lives in a van because they haven't had the background work performed for them to set them up so that they, have a birth certificate or a passport on hand that they can use to actually get the identity ball rolling.
Totally. And also things like not having bad credit. Like if you've made mistakes as a young person and you were foolish enough to go and get yourself a Q card and you didn't pay it back, or, wanted something great in your house and you've ended up owing money and debt collectors knock on your door and now you've got bad credit. Why would a landlord bother? There's about 30 or 40 other people lining up for your rental. Why would you bother giving it to somebody who you're not sure if they can pay the rent, even if they've got evidence of, no current history around debt or bad credit? What if they've got history or evidence that they can pay their rent every single week because they've got a great job? So yeah, there's lots of things that will get in the way for people. And because we don't have enough housing for people, it's really landlords are able to pick and choose who they want. And, if you were a landlord, why wouldn't you? Yeah. So there's an interesting thing. There's a sort of phrase called functional zero. And it's essentially the idea that homelessness, in the context of homelessness, that when there is enough housing stock that is greater than the need, then that's sort of this functional zero. So it's not that every person has to be in a home, but you could argue that there's a potential for ending homelessness when there's enough housing supply versus the amount of people that want it, and we're not there as a country. So yeah, there's a few sort of ways of looking at success, measuring success, and one of those is sort of that functional zero approach.
Talking about supply and this notion of functional zero. You said there were 25,000 people waiting to be housed.
25,000 households, so that's not individuals.
So how do you define a household?
So this is MSD public housing or social housing waitlist rating. So my understanding is that if there's me and my 2 children, I'm the main applicant. So I'm one of the 25,000, but my 2 children are my household. So that's one of the 25,000 is actually 3 people.
Do they collect data on the total number of people on that list represented by those households?
They do, and they do because they're also trying to understand what the housing need is. So the majority of the people on the wait list are waiting for a single bedroom or a two bedroom. So that would tell you that they're one person or they're two people. So the majority of people in New Zealand waiting for social housing are single people, essentially. So they do collect that data because they need to know what type of housing that they are needing. I just say that MSD collects that data. So this is where there's sort of interesting things about government departments wearing different hats, all within this housing continuum. So MSD are the social housing or public housing assessors. They do your assessment. They determine whether or not you meet the criteria for a social housing house, and what your rating is, your priority rating. And then, but Kāinga Ora generally have the properties. They're not the only housing provider, but they're the main one. And they have their own, they have the housing stock, and they come to MSD and they say, we've got two houses, and they look at some ratings, and they determine who they're going to pick for that. So you've kind of got these multiple government departments in there, working on the same issue. And it hasn't always been like that, but that's the way it's been for a number of years.
Do you know the number of people on that represented by those 25 households?
I don't. I think it's around 40,000, but I don't know for certain.
When National, led by John Key, got in 2008, they made a public statement saying that they were going to sell off social housing stock. Now, they may not have said it then. They might have said it actually in 2015, now that I think about it, but I don't, but they proceeded to sell, I think, about 3,000 houses. Since then, since Labour under Jacinda Ardern got in, they built, I think, 8,000 houses. And the issue with this narrative is that, the national government made the problem worse and the Labour government swooped in and saved it, is that these were just houses that were owned by the government when John Key was, when the national government was selling them off. And the argument can be made that freed up capital for renting more houses, say. I mean, I'm not saying I accept this narrative, but it does exist, and it needs to be properly refuted, and I don't expect us to do that here. And then in comes Labour, and they build all these houses, more houses than have been built by any government since the 60s, from memory, or purchased. And yet, the total number of people waiting for social housing has increased. Why? What is driving this increase in need for social housing? And why are we failing? Why is the government not able to keep pace with it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's someone brighter than me will be able to answer that first question. I think about why it's increased. One thing that I've always wondered about is whether or not we, with COVID and the pandemic and getting people into emergency housing. So what happened around the pandemic in that first year is that all the government departments kicked into gear and got everyone off the street and into emergency housing. We had emergency housing before that, but it was hard to access. There was not really a huge momentum to get people into emergency housing. And then you have a global pandemic, and really the push is to get everyone off the street. Well, to be in emergency housing, you do need to be on the wait list for social housing or showing that you're looking for permanent housing. So I have often wondered if actually there was an increase in people waiting for social housing, one of those determinants of the homelessness population, because we had made this way for people who were couch surfing, who were in overcrowding situations, who were living in their vehicles, who were in really unsafe situations, who were in boarding houses, et cetera, to see that there was a pathway to get permanent housing. So I'm not saying that that's the only thing, but I've often wondered if that was something that kind of kick-started it. There was a real increase in the number of people on the social housing waitlist in December 2022. I think it was then that it peaked. Then it came down a little bit and then it went back up. And I think, that sounds about right, that it kind of kept going up in 2021 and 2022. So there's something around that. And in terms of keeping pace, I mean, I think that's it. You've got to keep going. You've got to keep building. There was a building sort of stopped, not just for government building, but all over. It really just had a couple of years of stopping. It got really expensive. Products were hard to get. All of those sorts of things. I guess what you want to see and what the Human Rights Commission were calling for and will continue to call for as long as they're around is that there is activity and a plan and action from the government to address the homelessness problem and to provide decent homes for people, for Kiwis and New Zealanders. And I think they've got some plans. There are plans in place, which is good, but that's the thing that we need to keep asking for and calling for, is that there is action, really measurable, transparent activity and action and momentum to address the problem of homelessness and to provide decent housing for people.
It's interesting you make the comment that, you feel that one of the factors behind these increased numbers is that because people needed to go into emergency housing for lockdown, that created not only an impetus to force people into emergency housing because it was quite a firmly handed policy on the part of the government, but that it also demonstrated that there was a path to getting a house through the channels that be, and that uncovered a problem that existed. It didn't exacerbate the problem. The problem didn't get worse or better. Well, arguably it got better. People found themselves in, with a roof over their head. But it was an event that showed us, at least uncovered some of the extent of the issue as it existed. The other thing that is what you just said brings to mind is the fact that we seem to be running our housing construction industry, let's say, to serve a market rather than to serve the needs of the people. And this is one of the underlying issues of the housing crisis that is very much overlooked, is that we always talk about the housing market. No one talks about the need for houses, not on the news, right? And really, this is this is at the center of what we're discussing, is the fact that there are not enough houses to meet the needs of everyone who needs a house. And no one is looking at building housing, apart from the government itself, to meet those needs. People are building housing to meet the needs of a market, to make money, not to provide one of life's essential services. And it's this mismatch between providing for the population and providing for the profits of a few that has created the environment that the Human Rights Commission found so concerning. Can you discuss a bit about what the Human Rights Commission's view on the situation in New Zealand is?
Yeah, and you've mentioned some of those things. I think one of the things that we need to talk about is that housing is a human right. It's not earned. It's not deserved. It's a human right. And I think that's what you're talking about when you talk about it being a market, and when we use it as a commodity. it does sort of change the nature of the conversation. Like language really matters. And I think that that's a great example. And that is one of the things that the Human Rights Commission called out for us to change our language around that. It's a right, not something that people earn. And I really understand when people feel frustrated when they see and read media articles and see on the news that these social housing tenants have trashed their houses. I mean, this is a really small number of people, really small, and actually, like, let's understand why that person has done that, because actually no one really wants to destroy their home. It's usually a matter of other things that are going on in their lives. So those sorts of media stories really undermine that idea that it's a human right. It's when those sorts of things get publicized that people go, well, they don't deserve that. And it's a really tricky place to be, because you do feel frustrated that someone's gone and wrecked something that that taxpayers have paid for. It is frustrating, but it still should be a human right. I guess one of the other things is that the Human Rights Commission made a point of stating that successive governments for decades have signed up to the International Bill of Rights, and we've committed to that as a country, and part of that is that people have a right to housing. So this is built into our essentially our constitution. It's something that we as a nation have signed up to, the right to housing, but haven't necessarily been proactively working towards addressing that, and probably not so much in the past, and maybe more so now recently in the last maybe 5 or so years, where it's really become such a big topic.
Well, Winston Peters had a solution, right? We could just, not sign the Bill of Rights anymore. That's one potential solution, although I do kind of feel like that undermines the credibility of the government, or maybe undermines the social contract, if that's a real thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we, like it or not, we're a country built on socialism. We're a country that is social security is something that's been part of our way and our way of life for decades. And I mean, that's who we are, and we care for vulnerable people. So it's not a great solution to do away with that.
No, well, I mean, the alternative is to push more and more and more people out of housing, and as it becomes more difficult to afford a house and or get into a rental, as housing becomes increasingly commodified, this problem can only really be expected to grow. And it doesn't seem like it's a problem we understand how to fix, or we have a real plan to fix as a nation. Or maybe we do. Maybe you can enlighten me.
There's a couple of mechanisms, and some of the things we've been talking about most of this time is around social housing. There's also things like accommodation supplements. So for people who it's really just an affordability problem, not I've got a criminal history, I've got bad credit, I've got no references from a previous landlord, those people are not going to get into a private rental. But if you have got a good reference, and you've got no criminal history, and you've got no tattoos on your face, and you've got no, and you could get a private rental if only it wasn't so expensive. The Social Securities Act, we've got accommodation supplement built into that. One of the problems with that, though, is that it's maybe because it's in legislation, that's a good thing, but maybe it's not, because it does mean that it hasn't been updated for many years. And so I don't really understand the logic around this, but if you earn $600 a week rent income, and you live in Karori in Wellington and you pay $300 a week rent, and or you have the same income and you pay the same amount of rent in a different suburb in a different city, your accommodation supplement rate is different. It's based on the suburb that you live in, not the amount of income you have and the cost of rent for that property. So it's very clunky and hasn't been updated as different suburbs get more expensive and others lose their value, if that ever happens. So yeah, there's a couple of mechanisms, but they don't all. None of them are really working. You kind of need multiple options, but they also do need to be working.
Yeah, it's providing for an increasing, subsidizing accommodation, like subsidizing food or subsidizing fuel, which we've done in the past, and Labor's done both. That it makes sense. It's an obvious thing. We have tax subsidies for different industries. We have tax subsidies for housing, for the housing industry, right? So having a subsidy and a tax subsidy is no different from a cash payment. Just insert that there for clarification, just for the record. So providing a subsidy for housing makes perfect sense, given that this is not necessarily affordable. But at the same time, I don't feel like I'm hearing an actual solution to the problem. I feel like, people are going to be continuously and increasingly reliant on services like those provided by DCM unless we come up with a structural solution.
I don't think it's helpful for the government to pull programs like Sustaining Tenancies, and we've heard that a little bit on the news. We'll see what happens, but we're a organisation that provides a sustaining tenancies service, and that's essentially to support people who are in tenancies who are struggling to maintain that. Sustaining tenancies, and it's such a great model. Why would?
So, what is the Sustaining Tenancies model?
It separates the landlord from the support service. So where there has been times where, say, Kāinga Ora, Housing New Zealand, provided both the tenancy management and the support. That sort of doesn't really work because you can't be landlord and social worker. So we, services like DCM and others around the country, provide the social work support for someone who is a vulnerable tenant. And that's a great thing to have. We're saying that once you give someone a house, that's not the solution. It doesn't end there. You don't say, hey, person with all your complex needs and issues and your trauma and you've lived on the street for such a long time and you don't actually know how to use the oven, and you don't say, hey, well, now you've got a house, you should be fine because you've got a house. It's more than that. It's the social support. It's about helping people to connect with their neighbours, teaching people how to cook and have a healthy lifestyle, how to keep their house clean, paying their rent on time, having power on, because having power on is a good thing, and it shouldn't be a decision that people are thinking, should I have power on or not? We're not a third world country, but that is what we support. A lot of people who have chosen to not have power because of the cost of that, and all that kind of thing. So having social work support for people who are not going to live well or not going to be able to hold on to that tenancy without some support for a time is a good thing. So yeah, that's one of those things that I guess we're worried about, in terms of the government indicating that maybe there's not value in that side of things. And then sort of some commentary around kicking bad tenants out. And like I mentioned before, I really understand that must be, that it's very frustrating to hear that people who have a house are trashing it and terrorizing their neighbors and all of that kind of thing. But it's a small number of people. But even that, the solution isn't just to make people homeless. Like, that's really not the solution. And to be honest, they're not becoming homeless, they're going into prison. And I think that that's another thing for us to be thinking about. Just today I was talking with my colleagues about a whānau member that we've been working with who was waiting for a house, and we were wondering where he was, and he's in prison. And I think, for some people, that is where they sometimes wait for their house, and it's like, this is crazy that that's where people are going to, and they can't be bailed from prison. There's no bailing address, so they're staying in prison for longer. So yeah, it's not great.
That's pretty grim. So people are actually just going to the cells so that they can get food and shelter.
Well, I probably sort of said it like that. I think it's more, I don't think people are saying, I've heard one or two people say, oh, well, I might as well just go to prison. I don't have a house. I might as well just go to prison. I've heard that. I don't know if people intentionally commit a crime to go into the cells, but, people are definitely unable to be bailed somewhere, and they stay in prison until they've got a bailing address. And if people are on the street and that's their only choice because they haven't been offered a rental somewhere, and they're not eligible for emergency housing or transitional housing, you kind of just get in trouble because it's a bit dog eat dog out there. There's very few people who, and again, I know I'm talking about the cohort of people that we work with at DCM. I'm talking about a smaller group of people, but it's pretty hard to live on the street and not connect with other people who are on the street who might be getting into trouble. And where do you drink your alcohol? If you drink, where do you drink your alcohol when you live on the street? Where do you, if without getting a liquor ban, fine, not be wrist.
Which sounds totally absurd to find someone who's find a street person for drinking on the street, because where are you going to send the fine and all the rest of it? That makes me think again that there's another cohort there that would be very hard to measure, and that's people who find themselves in jail, can't be bailed, but then also might, it might be a factor leading people to be less concerned, less deterred from petty crime that's going to land them in jail because they've got nowhere better to be.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And again, this is not everyone. This is a smaller group of people. But yeah, there's definitely a sense of, well, yeah, I'm not deterred by that. Like, going to prison isn't, who cares? What that's not a deterrent for me. One of the, there's a select committee at the moment looking at rehabilitative programs for people, for all prisoners, not just people who are sentenced, but those on remand. And it's crazy that we're still talking about that. But that wouldn't that be amazing that anyone who's on remand in custody, who's waiting to go up in front of a judge, could access some kind of rehabilitative counselling group, course, therapy, whatever, to address the reason for them going in there. In Wellington, we have a court called the Special Circumstances Court. It's an amazing court. It's been around for 10 years or something like that. It started with a local judge who could see that many of the people that she was seeing for like petty crimes, who were homeless, actually had a social need, had a health need, or had some other kind of need that wasn't, that was sort of driving them or not helping in terms of crime. And so the Special Circumstances Court sort of started from that need. And it's the idea that people who are homeless, who are offending with particular crimes, not these serious ones up here, but some of that petty crime, Yep, those people could go through this court, and actually what happens is that they have this wraparound support plan. They have to plead guilty, so they have to say, yes, I did that thing. But it might take sort of 6 to 9 months, and they're working through that court, and they're working through a social plan with support to address the underlying cause, not just to go, you did that, this is your punishment, see ya, you're out of here. It's more effective in the long term. Bigger investment in time and money, resource, etc., etc. But the idea is that then people are supported and with the actual cause of the crime. So it's a really great thing to have that sort of initiative around this.
Yeah, well, the alternative, right? I mean, it's like I feel like if you come from a position of privilege, it's very easy to have a punitive sense of justice. But if you don't, and the reason is that you can't really see what it would be like to not have all the extensive support that someone like myself and maybe yourself take for granted, like, for example, having a copy of my birth certificate that was organized for me by someone else, which is actually kind of a hard thing to get your hands on, and can be a really, really big deal if you lose it, which I have done as an adult and had to get a new copy. It was a very big deal. And the alternative and the more sensible, approach, you would assume, is rehabilitation and using the justice system as a tool for rehabilitation. I mean, they do call it corrections, right? And you're not going to correct any behavior by giving someone a fine that they're never going to be able to pay, sending them to jail, which is a place where, at least, they've got nowhere better to be, so may as well be there. There's some company and 3 hots and a cot. And then, it's just not actually, and then they go out and they're back at square one. There has to be some kind of ladder to help people climb out of the situation that is leading to these kind of small crimes.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that you've just said reminds me of something. So yes, they come back and they go back to square one. Sometimes they go back to square zero. With the social housing register, for example, if you lose your income, so if your benefit stops because you're in prison and so you're not entitled to your benefit, you can't evidence that you can pay rent if you were given a house. So you fall off the social housing wait list. So what happens is that people who have been on it for 12 months or so, say if they go into prison, their benefit stops, they come off the social housing wait list. They can go back on it, but actually people don't know that that's what's happened. So we have people coming here and we go, hey, you on the social housing register? Yeah, I've been on it for 5 years. And you go, hang on, that doesn't sound right. The wait list is long, but that doesn't sound right. And you call and you find out that they'd actually fallen off that wait list. So yeah, sometimes it's not even square one. Sometimes it's before that, or they've gone into prison and their bank account was in deficit and it continued to be in deficit, and then the bank shut their bank account because they actually weren't good with their money, and the bank's going, we haven't met your end of the bargain, so we're shutting your bank account. And they come back out and they've got nowhere for their income to go, and now they can't go back to that bank because they've got a black mark against their name. So yeah, it's really tricky. This is stuff that I didn't know until I started working here. I just didn't know it, and I felt when I started working here, I met people who I'd seen on the street for years, and I spent time with them over a cup of coffee and having a laugh and doing the word find, and and these guys are amazing. They're just great people who have had a really crappy time and have had some terrible things happen in their life, but there's resilience, there's humor, there's intelligent conversations, there's really amazing gifts to offer. And I do understand I do understand the fear that people feel when they walk past someone who's begging or rough sleeping. Now, I felt that, but once you get to know people, you really get to know that we're all just humans. And so it's we try and do things that break down those barriers and try and build and foster relationships and conversations with people, because I think, again, that sort of changes the perception, breaks down barriers and judgments and preconceived ideas about someone's situation.
Yeah, the way you describe the housing register, it really sounds like a game of snakes and ladders. And I didn't even think about the private nature of the financial component, right? Like we have a system where we have a license to print money that we give to banks, and that's what a banking license is. And those banks are then responsible for providing financial services to the populace. But one of the downsides of privatizing, money printing and, money handling is that in cases where someone might not be profitable to provide that service to, that service can disappear. And then that person is stuck in this challenging administrative situation of being harder, dealing with organizations that are discriminative by nature. I'm not giving banks grief for discriminating about being discerning about their customer base, but by nature they're discriminatory, and this person who is not a priority to serve still needs that service in order to be able to function in the world, and they're going to have an even harder time than you or I might trying to actually obtain that service.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And yes, there are programs, and some of the banks have programs that are targeted at vulnerable clients and vulnerable customers, but they tend to be sort of elderly and not vulnerable as in really difficult. And it's a tricky one, because they can pick and choose, and they can shut someone's bank account and they can trespass them, and that's the end of it, and it doesn't really matter, but matters to that person. We provide a money management service here, where we're essentially the bank for people who can't get a bank. And obviously there's a high level of scrutiny and audit and oversight over that, because of the nature of standing in the middle of someone and their money, and we hold their money. But the hope is that we wouldn't be that for a long time, that would be a really short-term thing, and that people would be able to go and get their own bank account. But it's not that easy. And I think that the experience that people have with other services, banks are an example, working income's another example, supermarkets are another example, that those things can be quite challenging and confronting for people. And so having that service delivered through a service like ours, where we're very non-judgmental, we've got high tolerance, low threshold to access the service, etc., etc. Unfortunately, we have lots of people that want to engage with our service and stay engaged. And the hope is that people actually, to thrive and to flourish, is to not continue to always rely on social services like DCM and other social services, but we just provide such great support for people and kindness and no judgment, and come back. Okay, you've yelled at me today. You need to leave. We can't have you yelling at us, but we'll see you tomorrow and we'll have a conversation about what happened today. It's that forgiveness and restoration and reconciliation that's so important for people who are already finding it quite hard to live in the world.
So I know we're running over time, but there were two things I wanted to. Well, first of all, I didn't realize you provided that money management service. That's pretty cool. That's something I've wondered about, how that gets resolved, and of course, it has to happen through some intermediary. There has to be someone acting as buffer, because there'd just be no way. So how do we change this? What are the steps that you'd like to see taken at an individual and a policy level to improve the state of affairs in New Zealand, Aotearoa?
The individual one is both the easiest and the hardest. What I really think makes the difference for people is to have to be accepted and to have kind people around them. And I think it's the easiest because it doesn't really take, it doesn't take a policy or a government or something to do that. It's just about individuals caring for others. But it's also the hardest because it does mean that you have to step outside of your comforts and your safety and your and take a risk maybe to talk to somebody that you might not talk to. And I'm talking about that when people move in around the corner from you, that instead of assuming that you'll never have any connection, I'm talking about trying to find a connection. And there are amazing communities out there who really who want to welcome others into their community, and that makes such a difference. So when people get a house, welcome them into your neighbourhood and get to know people. And I say that because of my experience that I shared before about when I first started working here, and I started spending time with the people who I had seen on the street as I was walking to and from my previous job. That when I spent some time with them, I realised that we both loved the same things and found some of the same jokes hilarious and had things in common. And so it can be done. And probably from a policy level, it's probably a few things. Keep working towards permanent housing, stop investing in homelessness. And that's a tricky thing because we've got to have, in the meantime, we do know that we need sort of emergency housing and transitional housing solutions because there aren't enough places, and it is better for people to be off the street and with a roof over their head, but that's not a long-term solution for people. So we've got to continue to invest in infrastructure and support systems that support people in permanent, decent housing. It's also very difficult, but it can be done because they've done it in other countries.
Yeah, and the savings in terms of, well, first of all, those houses are valuable assets if we build them ourselves for the government. If the government builds them themselves or purchases themselves, right, they seem to be going up in value. Seems to be a pretty good investment. And then a good use of taxpayer dollars. And then on top of that, it saves the social costs of petty crime, general sense of alienation from your community and the people in your city, because you have people who are walking around who have not had a good night's sleep because they've spent it under streetlights or in a bush or whatever you, or in a van or in a car with the seat rolled back, which is not really the best way to spend an evening. I can see how that really does need to be a focus.
Social investment, and there are ways of measuring, and there are measurements happening around that social investment and the impact of investment over time for people. There's a lot of people have a lot of interactions with government departments over many, many, many years. And if we could simplify some of that and speed up some of that and, condense some of that and streamline some of that, there would be savings. It's a problem that we silo different parts of people's lives within different government departments. So, there's ways of it being financially beneficial as well as socially beneficial for people.
Well, thanks so much, Natalia. This has been really, really great. You've been a great person to elucidate the realities of the issue around homelessness on the ground, or houselessness on the ground, maybe is the term. And because Yeah, it's an issue that gets discussed in a very dry and matter of fact way on TV, for example, but it's very rare to have an opportunity to speak to someone who actually engages with this issue on the ground in its multivariate forms. So thank you very much for taking the time and giving us this picture. It's invaluable.
Oh, you're so welcome. I love any opportunity to inform people of what it's really like for people out there and what the system is like for people, because it's complex. And I really appreciate being able to speak to that. And I hope that people learn something from it. And I'm always happy to answer more questions if they come up as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much.